the night America almost collapsed. Imagine this. It's October 1907. Crowds gather in the cold outside New York banks, fists pounding against locked doors. Mothers clutch their children, fathers yell in anger, and the police struggle to hold the mob back. Inside those banks, empty vaults. Lifetimes of savings, gone overnight. Across Wall Street, men in top hats whisper nervously in smoke-filled offices, stock tickers clattering like war drums. Entire companies vanish in a single afternoon. One headline reads, "Financial system on the brink of ruin." And at the very center of this chaos stands one man, J.P. Morgan, the wealthiest, most feared banker in America. The government is powerless, the president can't act, Congress is paralyzed. And so, the survival of the United States economy falls on the shoulders of a single individual, a man both revered and hated. But here is the real shock. Out of this meltdown came something that still controls your money today, the Federal Reserve. This isn't just dusty history. This is the story of how greed, corruption, and blind speculation nearly destroyed America, and how one night in a private library reshaped the financial world forever. And if you think this could never happen again, remember the headlines you've seen in your own lifetime: 2008, 2020, bank runs, bailouts. The panic of 1907 isn't a relic, it's a warning. Before we dive in, I want you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss more mind-blowing stories of money, power, and the hidden history they never taught you in school. Smash that like button to help push this video out to more people. And share this with a friend who thinks Wall Street always wins. Because trust me, after this story, they won't look at money the same way again. This is Blood and Fortune, and today, we reveal the panic that shook America to its core. The financial crisis of 1907. Have you ever wondered what happens when the entire financial system just breaks? No government rescue, no safety nets, just pure, unfiltered panic. Today, we're going back to 1907, a year when America's glittering age of progress came crashing down, and the entire economy was saved not by the president, but by one private banker with an iron will. The year is 1907. America is booming. Skyscrapers are piercing the clouds in New York. Factories are churning out steel, and Wall Street feels like the center of the universe. But beneath this shiny surface, something is deeply wrong. There's no Federal Reserve, no FDIC insurance to protect your savings. The banks are like private casinos, run by powerful men gambling with your money. Imagine you deposit your life savings, thinking it's safe, but secretly the bank is using it to bet on risky copper mines and shady railroad deals. If those bets go south, your money vanishes. And in 1907, the bets were about to collapse in the most spectacular way possible. Meet the villains of our story. First, there's F. Augustus Heinze, a flashy copper tycoon who thought he could outsmart the entire stock market. His grand plan was to corner the copper industry, buying up all the shares to squeeze his rivals. It was a scheme built on pure arrogance, and it backfired beautifully. The market turned against him, and his empire crumbled almost overnight. As his personal fortune evaporated, people started whispering, "If Heinz's bank is in trouble, what about the others?" Then there's Charles W. Morse, the Ice King of New York. This guy had a reputation for controlling the city's ice supply and jacking up prices. Now he was involved in a web of shady banking deals, using smoke and mirrors to prop up failing banks. When the truth about his scheme started to leak, confidence didn't just fade, it evaporated. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors ignited a full-blown panic. People rushed to withdraw their money. One bank fell, then another. The financial system suddenly looked like a line of dominoes, and the first few were already tipping over. The final spark that lit the powder keg came in mid-October. A group of speculators, tied to Heinz's crumbling empire, made a reckless attempt to take over the United Copper Company. The plan was a disaster. It collapsed within days, dragging stock prices down with it. The fear spread like a virus, infecting banks and trust companies. The biggest victim was the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of New York's most respected financial institutions. When word got out that its president had ties to the disgraced Heinze, depositors swarmed the building, demanding their money. Clerks frantically counted out cash as the crowds outside grew larger and more desperate. By the end of the day, the Knickerbocker couldn't pay. It slammed its doors shut. Just like that, one of the largest trust companies in America was gone. Now imagine being there. Picture the streets filled with crowds, their faces pale with fear. These were ordinary people, shopkeepers, factory workers, families, who had trusted these banks with everything they had. Now, they were watching their life savings disappear before their very eyes. The newspapers were screaming disaster. The stock market was in a free fall. And in 1907, there was no government agency you could call. There was no central bank to step in and stop the bleeding. The entire system was built on a fragile thing called confidence, and that confidence was shattered. Suddenly, every bank was suspect. Was your bank safe? Could you get your money out before its doors closed for good? This was the real terror of the panic of 1907. It wasn't just numbers on a ledger. It was the raw, primal fear of losing everything. People ran from one bank to the next, a human wave of desperation trying to salvage whatever they could. The more they panicked, the faster the system bled out. It was a vicious cycle, and it seemed completely unstoppable. The failure of the Knickerbocker set off a catastrophic chain reaction. Other trust companies faced bank runs. The stock market crashed even further. Businesses went bankrupt. Factories laid off thousands of workers, and the entire national economy spiraled toward disaster. To make matters worse, international investors lost all faith in America. They pulled their money out, which only intensified the crisis. The United States was teetering on the brink of total financial collapse. So where was the government in all this? Here's the truly shocking part. They could do almost nothing. President Theodore Roosevelt was more interested in breaking up monopolies than saving banks. Congress had no real tools to intervene. The Treasury had limited funds and even less authority. Think about that. The United States, the richest and most powerful nation on earth, had no central bank. There was no lender of last resort. And so, the fate of the entire American economy rested not in the hands of its elected leaders, but in the hands of a few powerful private financiers. And this is where our story takes a dramatic turn. As the nation descended into chaos, one name began to dominate every conversation: John Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan wasn't just a banker, he was the banker. A true titan of finance who controlled railroads, steel empires, and a vast network of banks. He was a man with a booming voice, piercing eyes, and a presence so commanding that even his fiercest rivals were afraid to challenge him. In 1907, Morgan was 70 years old, but he was about to face the biggest challenge of his life. He understood something that few others did. When confidence is gone, the only thing that can restore it is overwhelming force and an overwhelming amount of money. By late October, America was paralyzed. The stock exchange was moments from shutting down entirely. Banks across the country were trembling, businesses faced ruin, and ordinary people were staring at hunger and despair. All eyes turned to one man, J.P. Morgan. Could a single private citizen save the entire system from itself? Or was the United States doomed to collapse? What happened next would become the stuff of Wall Street legend. In a dramatic high-stakes showdown, Morgan would summon the most powerful men in America to his private library, lock the doors, and refuse to let them leave until they agreed to fund a rescue. But that is the next chapter of our story, because before the savior came the storm, and the panic of 1907 had only just begun. Picture this. It's a cold October evening in New York, 1907. Wall Street isn't just in trouble, it's on fire. Not with actual flames, but with the inferno of pure, unadulterated fear. The Knickerbocker Trust, one of the city's biggest banks, has just collapsed. And like dominoes in a hurricane, the others are tipping, one by one, by the hour. On the streets, it's absolute chaos. Men in bowler hats are shouting, pounding on the shuttered doors of banks, desperate to get their life savings before it all vanishes into thin air. Women clutch their children, weeping as stone-faced clerks turn them away. Horse-drawn carriages clatter past crowds chanting, "Give us our money! Give us our money!" Inside the stock exchange, the ticker tape is printing a story of financial death. Numbers are plummeting. Fortunes that took lifetimes to build are evaporating in minutes. A traitor, his face white as a ghost, rips his ledger in half and storms out, muttering, "It's all over." The American economy is teetering on the edge of a cliff. But just across the street, inside a grand, dark brownstone at 23 Wall Street, a very different scene is unfolding. Here, under the soft glow of gas lamps, the fate of the entire United States is about to be decided by one man, J.P. Morgan. At 70 years old, John Pierpont Morgan was more than a man. He was a living legend. With his massive frame, his famously piercing eyes, and a nose so red and bulbous it was said to frighten small children, Morgan wasn't just a banker, he was a force of nature. He had built railroads, forged monopolies, and had even bailed out the U.S. Treasury during a crisis back in 1893. Presidents were wary of him. Wall Street practically worshipped him. They called him the master of money. But even Morgan had never faced a crisis like this. America wasn't just wobbling, it was on the brink of total collapse. So, on the night of October 24th, 1907, Morgan did something extraordinary. He summoned the most powerful financiers in the country to his home, not to the White House, not to Congress. He called them to his library, and Morgan's library was no ordinary room. Imagine a Gothic cathedral, but built for books and backroom deals. Dark mahogany shelves soared to the ceiling, packed with priceless ancient manuscripts and rare Bibles. A massive fireplace cast a warm glow against intricately carved stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of rich cigar smoke and old polished leather. And there, in the center of it all, sat J.P. Morgan himself, behind a massive oak desk, staring down the men who now depended on him for their very survival. Among them were the titans of American finance: George F. Baker, head of First National Bank; James Stillman, leader of National City Bank. There were executives from trust companies, railroads, and brokerage houses. Even representatives from the U.S. Treasury were there, present but essentially powerless. These were the richest, most powerful men in America, and yet in Morgan's library, they looked like nervous schoolboys waiting for the headmaster. Then came the moment that would go down in legend. Morgan gave a quiet order. The heavy wooden doors to the library were shut and locked. The men looked around, a wave of unease rippling through the room. Some muttered under their breath. Morgan leaned forward, his deep, commanding voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We will not leave this room," he declared, "until we have a plan to save this nation." There was no debate. There was no democracy. This wasn't Congress, and this wasn't the president's cabinet. This was Morgan's court, and tonight, he was the judge, the jury, and the only possible savior. One by one, the bankers tried to argue. They complained about the risk. They resisted putting their own fortunes on the line. They feared throwing good money after bad. Morgan listened patiently, puffing on his enormous cigar, his eyes glowing like embers in the firelight. Then, his patience ran out. With thunder in his voice, he gave them no choice. He demanded, he didn't ask, he demanded, that each bank and trust company contribute millions of dollars to a massive rescue pool. This fund would be used to prop up the failing institutions, restore a sliver of confidence, and, most importantly, keep the stock exchange from closing its doors for good. Some of the bankers balked. They argued about their potential losses, about the fairness of it all. One man was heard whispering, "We're being asked to risk everything." Morgan stood up. His immense frame towered over them, his shadow stretching across the grand library. "Gentlemen," he boomed, "if we do not act, by tomorrow there will be no banks left to argue over, no fortunes, no America as we know it. The choice is simple: contribute or be destroyed." A heavy silence fell over the room. Then, one by one, defeated, the men picked up their pens and signed their pledges. The meeting dragged on, deep into the night and into the early hours of the morning. Numbers were crunched, deals were hammered out, and any further resistance was ruthlessly crushed. At one point, a banker, desperate for a way out, tried to leave. Morgan ordered the doors barred again. There would be no escape, no compromise. Finally, as dawn approached, the exhausted and beaten bankers relented completely. They had pledged tens of millions of dollars, a truly staggering sum for the time. And with those pledges, J.P. Morgan had single-handedly engineered the survival of the American financial system. But he wasn't done yet. Morgan knew that if the New York Stock Exchange collapsed, the panic would spiral completely out of control. So he devised another brilliant plan on the spot. He forced the leading financiers to provide liquidity, cash, directly to the exchange. He essentially created an emergency lending facility, a precursor to what we now know as the Federal Reserve. And it worked. The stock exchange, bruised and battered, limped on. And slowly, ever so slowly, confidence began to return. By the end of October, the worst of the panic had passed. Banks stabilized. The markets stopped their freefall. The nation had been saved. Not by Congress, not by the president, but by one man, in his private library, who forced the richest men in America to bend to his will. Some hailed Morgan as a hero. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Morgan saves the nation." Ordinary citizens, while naturally suspicious of bankers, had to admit that without him, they might have lost every penny they had. But others were horrified. They asked a terrifying question. How could a single private citizen hold so much power? How could the fate of the entire United States depend not on democracy, but on the whim of one unelected man? Even Morgan himself reportedly said afterward, "I hope to God I never have to do it again." That midnight meeting in Morgan's library became one of the most famous and pivotal moments in American financial history. It revealed both the incredible fragility of the system and the terrifying concentration of power held by a few private bankers. In the years that followed, the memory of 1907 haunted Congress. Lawmakers realized that the nation could not, and should not, depend on one powerful individual to rescue it from disaster. And so, out of the ashes of the panic of 1907, a new institution would eventually be born: the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. But that was still years away. For now, just picture those bankers, finally leaving Morgan's library at dawn. Their faces are pale, their expensive suits are rumpled, and their signatures are inked on a deal that changed history. Behind them, J.P. Morgan sits back in his chair, the smoke from his last cigar curling toward the ceiling. Knowing he had just done what no government on earth could, he had saved America, or had he simply reminded everyone who truly ruled it? The dawn after J.P. Morgan's midnight meeting broke gray and cold over New York City. Crowds still gathered outside banks, newspapers still screamed disaster, and Wall Street still trembled. But something had changed. Inside the vaults of the city's most powerful institutions, money was moving again. The rescue pool Morgan had forced the bankers to sign on to was flowing into troubled trust companies, propping them up, one at a time, like sandbags holding back a flood. And slowly, very slowly, confidence began to creep back. The biggest threat was still the trust companies. These were financial firms that operated like banks, but were less regulated, more reckless, and deeply entangled in the speculative schemes that had caused the panic in the first place. When the Knickerbocker Trust collapsed, depositors across the city panicked, lining up outside every trust company they could find. Morgan knew this was the battlefield. If the trusts failed, no amount of stock market money would matter. So he sent his lieutenants, teams of lawyers, bankers, and accountants, racing across New York to examine the books of each trust company. Those deemed salvageable would be rescued. Those too far gone would be left to die. The public didn't see these ruthless calculations. All they saw were doors either reopening or closing forever. The most dramatic moment came at the Trust Company of America, one of the largest institutions in the city. Depositors swarmed its doors, so many that police had to push back the crowds. Inside, the bank's president begged Morgan for help. Morgan's men examined the ledgers, weighed the assets against the liabilities, and finally gave their verdict: it can be saved. But only with immediate support. And so, Morgan pulled millions from the rescue pool, funneled it into the trust company, and ordered the press to report that it was backed by the full faith of Wall Street's most powerful man. The crowds read the headlines. The panic lines outside the trust company thinned. The run slowed. Confidence, as fragile as glass, was beginning to mend. But another domino was threatening to fall. The New York Stock Exchange itself. With banks hoarding cash, brokers couldn't get the loans they needed to settle their daily trades. Trading was on the verge of being suspended, an act that would have sent shockwaves not just through America, but across the globe. In one legendary scene, the president of the exchange rushed to Morgan's office in near hysteria. He begged for $25 million in cash, immediately, or the exchange would collapse within minutes. Morgan didn't flinch. He summoned the biggest bankers and trust presidents, laid the situation before them, and once again demanded contributions. By sheer force of will, he cobbled together the funds. The money poured into the exchange, keeping the ticker running. It was a close call, but the market survived. As Morgan's interventions took hold, the newspapers began to change their tone. Instead of doom, they now carried headlines about his actions. Wall Street stabilized. J.P. Morgan leads rescue. Ordinary Americans who had cursed bankers only days before now whispered that perhaps this iron-willed financier was not their enemy, but their savior. The crowds outside the banks began to shrink. Factories, which had closed for lack of credit, cautiously reopened. The vicious cycle of panic was finally breaking. But behind the scenes, Morgan himself was stretched to his absolute limits. For nearly 3 weeks he barely slept. He worked day and night in his library, a one-man command center, orchestrating rescues, forcing mergers, and calming panicked bankers. He was personally guaranteeing millions in loans. His fortune was on the line, his reputation too. At one point, his doctor warned him the strain could kill him. Morgan ignored it. He knew that if he faltered, the whole system could collapse again. He was the only thing holding it all together. Just when it seemed the storm was passing, a new crisis hit. And it wasn't a bank. It was the city of New York itself. The city government suddenly found itself unable to sell its bonds. Investors, still shaken, refused to buy municipal debt. Without fresh funds, New York risked being unable to pay its essential workers, police, teachers, firefighters. The image of America's greatest city going bankrupt during a financial panic would have been catastrophic, and so once again the call went to Morgan. This time he orchestrated a syndicate of bankers to buy the city's bonds directly, using their own money. New York survived, barely. By November 1907, the worst was over. The runs on the banks slowed to a trickle. The trust companies stabilized. The stock exchange limped back toward normalcy. The city's payrolls were met. America had stared into the abyss, and somehow it had pulled back. And at the center of it all was one man who never held public office, who was never elected, but who had just acted as the de facto central bank of the United States, J.P. Morgan. The nation was divided. Was he a hero or a tyrant? Some newspapers praised him as a savior, the man who had single-handedly prevented financial ruin. Others were horrified. How could the fate of the richest country in the world rest in the hands of one unelected banker? The question lingered in the halls of Congress. If Morgan had not been there, if he had been ill, if he had simply refused, what then? The panic of 1907 made one thing painfully clear. America needed more than one man's fortune and one man's will. It needed a system. The crisis had been contained. The dominoes had stopped falling. But the scars of 1907 ran deep. And in the years to come, those scars would drive lawmakers, bankers, and presidents to build something new, something permanent, something that is still with us today, the Federal Reserve. The year is 1907. The panic is over. The banks have reopened, Wall Street has survived, and the great factories of America are roaring back to life. But the memory of those terrifying weeks, the fear, the riots at the bank doors, the heartbreaking image of ordinary families losing their life savings overnight, that memory is now burned deep into the American mind. And one unbelievable truth could not be ignored. The entire system had been saved. Not by the government, not by Congress, not even by the president. It was saved by one private citizen, the titan of finance, J.P. Morgan. For some, this was a miracle, a testament to the power of American capitalism. But for others, it was absolutely terrifying. They called it the Morgan problem. Newspapers hailed Morgan as the savior of Wall Street. But in the halls of power, politicians were asking a much darker question. What happens when Morgan dies? Because one day, he would. And the next panic might come when there is no iron-willed financier ready to lock the nation as top bankers in his library and literally force them to save the country. It was just too much power, too much responsibility, resting in the hands of one mortal man. The nation had seen its own weakness, and it couldn't look away. In Washington, the panic of 1907 sparked an outcry. Senators and congressmen demanded hearings. Economists debated furiously in newspapers. And ordinary citizens, the ones who had stood in those desperate bank lines, were asking a simple question. Why was our government so powerless while a handful of private bankers ran the entire show? The answer, it seemed, was clear. America needed a central bank, an institution that could step in when things went wrong. But there was a huge problem. Americans hated central banks. I mean, they really, really hated them. A century earlier, President Andrew Jackson had famously destroyed the Second Bank of the United States. He called it a monster, a dangerous institution that gave far too much power to wealthy bankers and elites. Ever since Jackson's victory, Americans were deeply suspicious of the very idea of a central authority controlling their money. They feared it would strangle democracy, enrich the powerful, and enslave ordinary people to debt. That old fear was still alive and well in 1907. So, when reformers started proposing a new central bank, the critics howled. They cried, "We will not resurrect the monster." And yet the alternative was just as scary. Without some kind of reform, the nation was practically guaranteeing another, even worse panic. And next time, there might not be a J.P. Morgan to save the day. The country might not recover. Into this firestorm stepped one man, Senator Nelson W. Aldrich. A powerful Republican from Rhode Island, Aldrich was a giant in Congress. More importantly, he was the chairman of the brand new National Monetary Commission, a body created specifically to study banking reform after the panic. Aldrich knew what had to be done. America needed a central institution, a lender of last resort, that could provide stability and prevent the dominoes of panic from ever falling again. But how do you design such a thing? And more importantly, how do you make it acceptable to a nation that loathed the very words, central bank? The answer came in 1910, at one of the most secretive and legendary meetings in all of American financial history. Under the cover of darkness, Senator Aldrich, along with a small hand-picked group of the country's most powerful bankers, we're talking representatives from J.P. Morgan's empire, from Kuhn, Loeb and Comber, and from the Rockefeller family's interests, boarded a private train car. Their destination was a secret. Jekyll Island, Georgia, a secluded exclusive club for the ultra-rich. There, for over a week, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, they drafted the blueprint for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve. They worked in absolute secrecy, for a very good reason. They knew that if the American public ever found out that a small group of Wall Street bankers were designing the nation's new money system, the outrage would kill the plan instantly. So they took incredible precautions. They traveled under fake names. They told their families they were going duck hunting. They even made a pact to not use each other's last names while at the club, referring to each other only by first name to avoid being overheard by the staff. Out of this cloak and dagger retreat came a brilliant hybrid proposal. It was a plan for a new central banking system, but one that cleverly balanced public oversight with private influence. It wasn't purely a government bank, which populists feared. Nor was it purely a banker's bank, which would have been political suicide. It was something new, something in between. Of course, the secret meeting was just the beginning. Years of brutal political battles followed. Critics screamed of conspiracies, of Wall Street's secret hand pulling the strings of government. Populists denounced the plan as a devious scheme to enslave farmers and workers to the almighty dollar. But the memory of 1907, the memory of those bank runs and shattered lives, was just too fresh, too painful. More than anything, Americans wanted safety. They wanted stability. They wanted an end to the panics. And so in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The United States finally had a central bank, a new institution that would issue a stable currency, hold reserves for the nation's banks, and most importantly, in times of crisis, it could lend money to stop a panic before it spiraled out of control. The creation of the Federal Reserve marked the end of one chapter in American history and the beginning of another. On one hand, the nation finally had a financial safety net, a lender of last resort, a mechanism that was supposed to be stronger than any one man. But on the other hand, the critics and conspiracy theorists never went away. They warned that the Fed wasn't a solution at all. It was just another J.P. Morgan, but this time hidden behind a government seal. A private cartel of bankers, they argued, disguised as a public institution, now in control of the nation's money. That debate has never, ever ended. Was the Federal Reserve a blessing or a curse? A savior designed to protect the people? Or a monster reborn in a new, more powerful form? And this is where the story of a crisis from over a century ago reaches out and touches us right now, in our own lives. Think about it. Every time there's a major financial crisis, from the Great Depression of the 1930s, to the crash of 2008, to the recent bank failures of our own time, the fingerprints of 1907 are all over it. The Federal Reserve still steps in, just as Morgan did, pouring billions, even trillions of dollars into the system to keep it from collapsing. And the very same questions that haunted Americans back then still haunt us today. Who really controls our money? Can a powerful central authority truly prevent panics? Or does it just create bigger ones down the road? Was J.P. Morgan's Midnight Rescue a warning sign of a system built on fragility? Or was it the model for how it must always be saved? The panic of 1907 didn't just rattle a few banks. It completely reshaped America. It revealed the terrifying fragility of our financial system. It showed the immense power of one person to bend the fate of an entire nation. And it gave birth to the single most powerful financial institution in the world today, the Federal Reserve. From J.P. Morgan's private library to the marble halls of Washington, the lesson seemed clear. In times of crisis, someone has to step in, or everything falls apart. And yet beneath the surface of our modern economy, the same deep-seated fear that haunted America in 1907 still lingers. What if the rescuer fails? What if, one day, even the system itself cannot save us? That is the shadow the panic of 1907 left behind. A shadow we all still live under, more than a century later. Have you ever heard of the Panic of 1907? It's a financial crisis that rarely makes the headlines, but it's a story that echoes through every major economic crash since, including the one we saw in 2008. It ended with a stronger banking system and laid the groundwork for the Federal Reserve. But history isn't just about institutions. It's about people. The ones who won, the ones who lost, and the ones history chose to forget. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the real fallout of 1907. When the dust settled, some of Wall Street's biggest players emerged not just unscathed, but more powerful than ever. At the center of it all was J.P. Morgan. His reputation was cemented. He wasn't just a titan of finance anymore. He was hailed as the man who saved America. His influence became so immense that even presidents seemed to defer to him. The firms that sided with him during the crisis, like the House of Morgan, National City Bank, and Kuhn Loeb, didn't just survive. They thrived. They absorbed their weaker rivals, consolidating their power in a way that would have been impossible otherwise. For Wall Street's elite, the panic was like a wildfire that cleared out the underbrush. It destroyed the small and the weak, leaving the giants to tower over a new, less crowded landscape. To them, this wasn't just a crisis. It was an opportunity. But for every winner, there were countless losers. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, once one of New York's most prestigious financial institutions, was the first domino to fall. Its failure triggered the chain reaction of panic, and it never recovered. For the thousands of depositors who had trusted Knickerbocker with their life savings, it was utter ruin. Suddenly, trust companies, once seen as safe havens for money, were viewed with suspicion and fear. Across the country, hundreds of smaller, local banks failed quietly, their names and the dreams they held vanishing from history. Imagine being a family who lost everything overnight. There was no government bailout, no FDIC insurance, no safety net. If your bank failed, your future failed with it. And what about the speculators? The gamblers who had bet big on a booming market. They were wiped out in an instant, their paper fortunes turning to ash. The real tragedy, however, wasn't felt in the grand boardrooms of Wall Street. It was felt in the homes of everyday Americans. Picture a factory worker who had scrimped and saved for a decade to buy a small house, only to wake up and find his bank had collapsed, taking every penny he owned with it. Think of a widow who had carefully placed her late husband's inheritance into a trust company, believing it was the safest place possible, only to be left penniless when its doors were shuttered for good. The history books don't often show you the long breadlines that formed in cities, the desperate strikes for living wages, or the quiet whispers of hunger and fear that haunted working-class neighborhoods. For these people, there was no Morgan miracle. There was only a deafening silence from the very system that had failed them. These are the forgotten voices, the clerks, the seamstresses, the immigrants, the families who paid the true price for Wall Street's high-stakes game. The shockwaves of the panic didn't stop at people's bank accounts. They rocked the halls of Washington, D.C. For years, the prevailing political wisdom was laissez-faire, a hands-off approach that trusted the market to correct itself. The panic of 1907 shattered that illusion. Politicians could no longer stand by and watch the entire financial system teeter on the brink of collapse. One of the most direct results was the creation of Senator Nelson Aldrich's Monetary Commission, which would eventually lead to the establishment of the Federal Reserve. But it was more than just banking reform. The crisis fueled the growing progressive movement, which demanded greater government regulation, protections for workers, and real oversight of the corporate giants who had seemed untouchable. The American people had seen the chaos that unchecked power could unleash, and they were demanding change. They would not forget what had happened. Beyond the economic and political shifts, the panic of 1907 left a deep psychological scar on the nation. The primal fear of a bank run. That haunting image of desperate crowds, clamoring outside the locked doors of their bank, became seared into the American consciousness. It was a ghost that would reappear time and time again. We saw it in 1929, at the dawn of the Great Depression. We saw it in 2008, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And we even saw it in 2023, when modern technology allowed digital bank runs to drain billions of dollars in a matter of hours, not days. The memory of 1907, of ordinary people made helpless by a system they couldn't control, is a wound that, it seems, has never fully healed. It speaks to a fundamental vulnerability that we are still grappling with today. And this brings us to the great irony of the whole affair. J.P. Morgan was celebrated as a hero, the savior of the American economy. But here, as here's the bitter truth. The man who saved the system was one of the key architects of the very system that made it so fragile. His immense, unchecked power was a central part of the problem. So, was he really a savior? Or was he just the most powerful player in a rigged game, stepping in to protect his own interests when things got out of hand? It was a question many Americans asked back in 1907, and it is a question we still ask today whenever we see a powerful few stepping in to manage a crisis they helped create. So why isn't the panic of 1907 a more common household story? Because history tends to be written by the victors, not the victims. It was quickly overshadowed by even bigger disasters like the Great Crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. But if you look closely, the DNA of every modern financial crisis can be traced back to 1907. Every time you read a headline about Wall Street greed, about a bank on the verge of failure, or about billionaires positioning themselves as the saviors of the system, you are watching an echo of that fateful year. The story is forgotten, but the pattern remains. In the end, the balance sheet of the panic of 1907 is starkly clear. The winners were the already powerful bankers and the colossal firms that grew even stronger by absorbing the wreckage. The losers were the ordinary people whose savings vanished, the smaller institutions that were erased from existence, and the countless voices silenced by the march of history. The panic reshaped America, but it did so on a tilted playing field. The scales tipped decisively toward the elite, while the immense burden fell squarely on the shoulders of the poor and the middle class. And that legacy, that fundamental imbalance of risk and reward, is what makes the story of 1907 more than just a historical footnote. It's a warning. The smoke from the panic of 1907 had barely cleared, but America wasn't just going back to normal. It was changing. The crisis hadn't destroyed Wall Street. It had reforged it, creating the financial world we recognize today. This is the story of what came next. The collapse was like a wildfire. It swept through the financial landscape, burning down weaker banks and shaky trust companies. But from those ashes, new giants rose. J.P. Morgan's banking empire, National City Bank, the ancestor of today's Citibank, and a select few others didn't just survive, they feasted. They devoured the assets, the customers, and the influence of the fallen. Every institution left standing now controlled a bigger piece of the American pie. It was a brutal, merciless cleansing, but for the victors, it was incredibly profitable. Remember the trust companies? They were the young, flashy, less regulated players at the heart of the panic. Many of them crumbled under the pressure of bank runs. But the ones that survived didn't just lick their wounds, they transformed into titans. They had stared into the abyss and learned a brutal lesson. Trust is everything. It's fragile and must be defended at all costs. In the years after 1907, these hardened trusts evolved into the massive institutions that would dominate finance for the next century. If there was one permanent scar left on Wall Street, it was fear. The panic drilled a crucial lesson into the minds of every banker. Confidence is the only currency that truly matters. Markets don't collapse because of numbers on a spreadsheet. They collapse because people panic. A single whisper could bring down a bank. A rumor could topple an entire industry. So after 1907, Wall Street became obsessed with managing its image. Bankers began constructing temples of finance, grand marble halls, imposing vault doors, and lobbies designed to radiate unbreakable strength and stability. Even the architecture became a weapon against panic. J.P. Morgan, the man who single-handedly stopped the bleeding, passed away in 1913, but his ghost haunted Wall Street for decades. The Morgan Empire became the blueprint for power. It had deep ties to Washington, controlled vast swathes of the railroad and steel industries, and held immense influence in Europe. The panic had made Morgan a legend, a figure larger than life. For years, the most important question in finance wasn't, what will the government do? It was, what would Morgan have done? His methods, ruthless yet undeniably effective, became the gospel for the next generation of financiers. But here's the great paradox. The very consolidation that stabilized Wall Street after 1907 sowed the seeds of its next great disaster. With stronger banks, fewer competitors, and more concentrated power, the system felt stable. But this was a fragile stability. By the time the Roaring Twenties arrived, this new supersized Wall Street was bolder, wilder, and richer than ever before. Speculation exploded. Fortunes were made overnight, and the painful lessons of 1907 started to feel like a distant memory. The foundations for that incredible boom, and its eventual catastrophic bust, were poured in the rubble of the 1907 crisis. Meanwhile, in Washington, the gears of change were slowly turning. Politicians, alarmed by how close the nation had come to total collapse, started pushing for new rules. They wanted more oversight, stricter reporting for banks, and limits on the kind of wild speculation that had caused the panic. But Wall Street was always one step ahead. For every new regulation, bankers found a new loophole. They adapted, they evolved, and they even learned to use the new rules to their advantage, crushing smaller rivals who couldn't afford the cost of compliance. The panic hadn't humbled them, it had educated them, and the lesson was clear. Survival isn't about avoiding risk, it's about controlling it. And what about ordinary Americans? For most, the sharp pain of 1907 eventually faded into the background of daily life. Workers returned to their factories, farmers to their fields, and families slowly rebuilt what they had lost. But something had fundamentally changed. A deep-seated mistrust lingered just beneath the surface. People no longer assumed their money was safe in a bank. They watched their financial institutions with a suspicious eye. They were more careful with their savings. The cracks from 1907 had been plastered over, but they were still there, waiting for the next tremor to shake the foundations. So, what was the true legacy of 1907? A Wall Street dominated by a handful of immensely powerful institutions, a financial culture obsessed with projecting an image of unbreakable confidence. The initial ideas that would eventually lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve were planted, even if they hadn't yet grown. And an entire nation had learned the hard way that its financial system was both its greatest engine of prosperity and its most profound vulnerability. The panic of 1907 didn't break America, but it did rewrite its financial DNA, and it served as a dark foreshadowing, because just over the horizon, only 2 decades later, the country would discover that the lessons from that crisis had not been enough to prevent an even greater collapse from coming. The Great Crash of 1929 was waiting. You might think the panic of 1907 was just a New York story, a Wall Street drama. But what happened in those frantic October weeks didn't stay in Manhattan. It was like a financial earthquake, and the aftershocks were felt across the entire globe, shaking the foundations of a newly interconnected world. While New York was scrambling to its feet, bankers in London, then the joint financial capital of the world, were watching American stocks plummet with sheer terror. Why? Because their own fortunes were tied directly to U.S. markets through bonds and investments. As Wall Street teetered on the brink, confidence in the entire transatlantic trade system began to crack. It was a chain reaction. Across the English Channel, in Germany and France, the panic spread. Investors started pulling their money out, calling in loans and hoarding gold. Banks in Berlin and Paris suddenly faced their own mini panics, desperately trying to stay liquid. Imagine the lifeblood of the global economy, international credit, slowing from a torrent to a trickle. This wasn't just numbers on a page. It meant factories slowed down, trade faltered, and jobs were at risk, all because of a crisis thousands of miles away. And this financial contagion respected no borders. It jumped continents. Take Argentina, a booming exporter of beef and grain. Suddenly, their European buyers got nervous. With US and European banks looking unstable, they hesitated to place orders. Argentine commodity prices collapsed, sending a shockwave through their entire economy. In Mexico and other Latin American nations, grand infrastructure projects funded by American investment ground to a halt. The credit tap was turned off. Even in Asia, the ripples were felt. In China and Japan, international investors, spooked by the volatility in America, hit the pause button on new deals. No one wanted to be exposed to the American market's wild swings. For countries that had come to rely on American capital for their growth, the panic was a sudden, brutal lesson in what we now call global interdependence. The domino effect was swift and merciless. Stock exchanges from London to Buenos Aires saw sudden, sharp drops. Shipping companies, uncertain if they'd be paid, delayed their cargo. Commodity prices, from wheat to copper, swung wildly as fear, not logic, drove the markets. Confidence, it turned out, was a far more powerful currency than gold itself. In Europe, small banks began to experience runs, just like the ones in New York. People lined up, demanding their money, fearing the bank would collapse. But there was a crucial difference. In America, you had one man, J.P. Morgan, with the immense power and personal will to step in and stop the bleeding. In Europe, there was no Morgan. Their central banks existed, but they were limited in scope and power. They didn't have the tools or the authority to stabilize the entire system on their own. The lesson was stark and unavoidable. In a world linked by invisible threads of finance, one city's collapse could ignite chaos everywhere. Ironically, the news that eventually calmed the world wasn't from a government or a king. It was from J.P. Morgan himself. When word spread that Morgan had successfully stabilized America's key banks and trust companies, a collective sigh of relief was heard in London, Paris, and beyond. Cautiously, global investors began to regain a sliver of confidence, but the damage was done. International firms had lost millions. Global credit remained tight for a long time, and the panic of 1907 planted a seed of doubt about the United States. This young, ambitious financial power had just shown the world how fragile it could be. It was a blow to America's reputation on the world stage. What the panic of 1907 truly revealed was something revolutionary for its time. Finance had become irrevocably global. A crisis could no longer be contained locally. New York's fear became London's anxiety. America's downturn threatened to pull Europe, Latin America, and Asia down with it. And it was a chilling preview of what was to come. In 1929, when the market crashed again, it didn't stay in New York. It swept across the world with breathtaking speed, partly because the lessons of 1907 were learned, but also partly forgotten. The legacy of 1907 is this fundamental truth of interconnected risk. It exposed how deeply major banks and financiers were intertwined across oceans. It proved that credit, currency, and trade relied on something as intangible as confidence. And it showed how a single country's panic could threaten nations that had nothing to do with the original cause. But out of that chaos, something important emerged: the first real glimmer of coordinated global finance. Morgan's bold strategies, forcing cooperation, providing liquidity, and acting as a lender of last resort, were a blueprint. They foreshadowed the international rescue efforts and the powerful roles that central banks, like the Federal Reserve, which was created in response to this crisis, would play throughout the 20th century and into today. And we can't forget the human stories behind the headlines. This wasn't just about bankers in smoky rooms. It was about families in Argentina whose livelihoods disappeared when the credit markets froze. It was about small investors in Europe, retirees, widows, middle-class workers, who saw their life savings evaporate overnight. It was about entrepreneurs in Asia, whose dreams of expansion were shattered because their American backers suddenly went broke. For ordinary people across the world, the panic of 1907 was an invisible disaster. They never saw J.P. Morgan's library, but they felt the shockwaves in lost wages, shuttered businesses, and dreams deferred. By stabilizing New York, Morgan didn't just save a city. He inadvertently set the template for modern financial crisis management. A powerful combination of private capital, government oversight, and central banking. The crisis taught the world a lesson that we are still learning today. In a connected economy, a financial fire in one country can quickly become a global inferno. When a bank fails in one part of the world now, we see markets tumble everywhere within hours. That's the legacy of 1907. So the panic of 1907 was far more than an American story. It was a global warning shot. It laid bare the fragile, intricate web of international finance and revealed just how much power individuals and institutions held over the fate of entire economies. J.P. Morgan may have saved America, but in doing so, he showed the world that even a savior couldn't stop all the dominoes from falling. The world rebuilt, but the echoes of 1907 would resonate through history, shaping our financial systems, our policies, and our crises for the next century and beyond. Think about the last time you felt a little financial anxiety. Maybe it was watching the news or seeing the price of groceries go up. Now imagine that feeling amplified 1,000,000 times, a collective wave of panic so powerful, it could bring the entire economy to its knees. That's not a modern horror story. It's the story of 1907, and what happened then is more than just a dusty chapter in a history book. It's a prophecy about our own time. Picture this: New York City, 1907. No iPhones, no 24-hour news, just whispers. A rumor starts that a major trust company is about to fail. People start lining up outside, demanding their money. The whispers turn into shouts. The lines turn into mobs. Bank after bank teeters on the brink of collapse, not because of some complex algorithm, but because of one simple, powerful force: fear. Confidence, the invisible glue holding the entire financial system together, had shattered. Now fast forward, 2008. Lehman Brothers goes under. Why? Yes, there were toxic assets and complex derivatives, but the real killer? A complete loss of faith. Nobody trusted anybody. Credit markets froze solid. Confidence evaporated, and the global economy went into a tailspin. And just last year, 2023. Remember Silicon Valley Bank? It didn't take days of people lining up on the street. It took minutes. People pulled out billions of dollars with a few taps on their phones. The bank run went digital. Panic, once a slow-moving crowd, now travels at the speed of light. The first and perhaps most timeless lesson of 1907 is that money is just a shared belief, and that belief is terrifyingly fragile. The moment it cracks, the system falls. So back in 1907, with the system collapsing, who saved the day? Not the government. There was no Federal Reserve. The savior was one man, J.P. Morgan. He was the titan of Wall Street. He famously locked the country's most powerful bankers in his private library and, using his own immense fortune and sheer force of will, strong-armed them into pooling their money to stop the bleeding. He literally forced them to save the system. It's an incredible story, but it's also deeply unsettling. What if Morgan had decided not to act? What if he'd been on vacation? The entire American economy was held hostage by the decisions of one unelected, incredibly wealthy man. This leads us to our second lesson. One person shouldn't hold all the keys. Today, we don't have a J.P. Morgan. Instead, we have central banks. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank. There are modern-day Morgans, small groups of people making monumental decisions about interest rates and bailouts that affect billions of lives. They have immense power to prevent collapse, but it begs the question, should the fate of the global economy ever rest in so few hands? When you look at the timeline of financial crises, a disturbing pattern emerges. It's like watching the same movie with a different cast. This is Lesson 3. Crises repeat in cycles. In 1907, the culprits were unregulated trust companies and wild speculation. Then in 1929, it was over-leveraged stocks that led to the Great Depression. Jump to 2008, and the villains were risky mortgage-backed securities. In 2023, it was the unique fragility of digitally run banks. Different tools, different jargon, but the underlying story is always the same. It starts with a boom, fueled by greed and overconfidence. Then comes the bust, the inevitable collapse, and finally, the rescue. The cycle of boom and bust, laid bare in 1907, hasn't gone away. It's just evolved. And what about those rescues? J.P. Morgan's intervention in 1907 wasn't pure charity. It was a power move. The bailout he orchestrated consolidated wealth and control into fewer, even more powerful institutions. The big players got bigger, and the gap between the rich and everyone else widened. This brings us to our fourth lesson. Bailouts always come at a price. Sound familiar? Think about 2008. Governments worldwide poured trillions of dollars into saving the too-big-to-fail banks. They saved the system from total meltdown. But what was the cost for ordinary people? Millions lost their homes, their jobs, their savings. The financial elite were rescued, while the public paid the price, both literally through taxpayer money and figuratively through years of economic hardship. The pattern is chillingly consistent. Rescues prevent Armageddon, but they often deepen inequality. The system survives, but we have to ask, at whose expense? In 1907, a crisis in New York sent shockwaves to London and beyond, proving that the world's financial arteries were already connected. Today, that connection is absolute. It's our fifth lesson. Global interconnection is both a strength and a weakness. A rumor in Silicon Valley can spark panic in Zurich. A property crisis in China can shake markets in Sao Paulo. This hyper-connectivity allows capital to flow efficiently, but it also means that financial contagion can spread like a wildfire. We've built a global financial system that is more powerful and sophisticated than ever, but also more fragile. A single weak link can threaten the entire chain. So we have all this history, all these painful lessons learned time and time again. This leads to the sixth, and perhaps most frustrating lesson of all. We are terrible at remembering. History is a warning we keep ignoring. After the panic of 1907, politicians promised reforms. The Federal Reserve was created to prevent such a crisis from happening again. Then came 1929. After the Great Depression, new regulations were put in place. Then came 2008. After 2008, we got Dodd-Frank and new rules for banks. Then came the scares of 2023. Each time we say, never again. We patch the holes in the ship. But human nature, Our capacity for greed, for panic, for collective delusion seems to always find new cracks to exploit. So where does that leave us today? Right now, global debt is at record highs. We see speculative bubbles in everything from cryptocurrencies to certain tech stocks. Central banks are walking a razor's edge, trying to fight inflation without triggering a recession. The parallels to the periods just before past collapses are, frankly, eerie. The truth is, the spirit of 1907 never died. It's not a ghost. It's a fundamental part of the system we've built. It waits, dormant, in the complex architecture of our modern economy, ready to wake up. The panic of 1907 wasn't just about money. It was a mirror held up to human nature. It showed us that our entire economic reality is built on the fragile foundation of confidence. It warned us that systems driven by unchecked greed will always teeter on the edge of a cliff. We have more sophisticated tools now. We have central banks, global institutions, and instant communication. But at our core, are we any different from those people lining up outside a bank in New York over a century ago? The fundamental story of boom, bust, and bailout is still our story. The only real question left is, when the next panic comes, because history tells us it will we finally have learned our lesson? Or will we be doomed to watch it all happen once again? Imagine this: New York City, 1907. The air is thick with desperation. Crowds swarm outside banks, their shouts echoing through the canyons of Wall Street. They're not protesting, they're begging for their life savings. Inside, clerks, their faces pale with fear, slam iron shutters closed. Families stand frozen on the sidewalks, clutching savings books that have become worthless pieces of paper overnight. The panic is palpable, a choking cloud hanging over the city. Miles away from the chaos, in the quiet grandeur of his personal library, one man sits like a king on a throne of leather and mahogany. J.P. Morgan. He's not shouting, not begging. He's dictating. With a calm, steady voice and the stroke of a pen, he decides which banks will survive and which will be left to perish. He is single-handedly steering the ship of the American economy through a hurricane he helped create. That moment, that singular display of power, wasn't just the climax of a crisis. It was the prologue to the next century of finance. It was the day the modern world was truly born, not in a government hall, but in a private library. The aftermath of the panic of 1907 was a sobering realization for America. The nation had been brought to its knees, only to be saved by the whim of a single, unelected financier. It was a terrifying thought. The consensus was clear: never again. The country needed a system, an institution bigger than any one man, to prevent such a catastrophe from recurring. And so, from the ashes of 1907, an idea took shape. An idea that would fundamentally reshape the global economy: the Federal Reserve. This new central bank was meant to be the ultimate backstop, the guardian of financial stability. It was designed to tame the wild cycles of boom and bust, to extinguish the sparks of panic before they could engulf the nation in flames. The promise was simple: the chaos of 1907 would be a relic of a bygone era. But was it? Look at the calendar of the 20th and 21st centuries. 1929, the Great Depression. 1987, Black Monday. 2000, the dot-com bubble bursts. 2008, the global financial crisis. 2020-2023. The list goes on. The haunting lesson is that while institutions change, the fundamental drivers of a crisis do not. The four horsemen of the financial apocalypse: greed, speculation, fear, and the inevitable rescue, they keep riding. We build higher walls, but human nature finds new ways to tunnel underneath. The names on the buildings change, the technologies evolve, but the cycle, the vicious, predictable cycle, remains unbroken. Let's do a thought experiment. Close your eyes and picture the world of 1907. Now, open them and look at today. The similarities are uncanny. Back then, rumors spread in smoky backrooms and gentlemen's clubs, passed by men in top hats and spats. Today, a single tweet from an influential account can trigger a digital bank run in seconds. The speed of information has changed, but its power to create panic is the same. In 1907, one powerful banker, J.P. Morgan, used his personal fortune and influence to orchestrate a bailout. He gathered the nation, his top financiers in his library, and locked the doors until they agreed to pool their resources. Today, we don't have a J.P. Morgan. We have central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan. They don't lock financiers in a room. They just turn on the printers, creating trillions of dollars, euros, and yen out of thin air to prop up the system. The scale is different, but the core action, a bailout from the top, is identical. And what about the average person? In 1907, they stood in physical lines, watching helplessly as the doors of their banks were barred. Today, we sit in front of our screens, hitting refresh on our online banking apps, watching numbers, our numbers, flicker and sometimes just vanish. The costumes have changed. The stage has gone from brick and mortar to digital, but the script feels eerily familiar. The roles of the powerful, the panicked, and the sacrificed are being played out all over again. So what is the real enduring legacy of 1907? Here is the truth that gets buried under layers of economic jargon and political spin. The Panic of 1907 was not some freak accident, a black swan event that could never happen again. It was a mirror, a brutally honest mirror held up to our entire financial system. And what did it show us? First, it revealed that our system, for all its complexity and supposed sophistication, runs on one thing and one thing only: belief, confidence, trust. And that belief is incredibly fragile. It can be shattered in an instant. Once it's gone, the entire edifice, no matter how strong it seems, can come tumbling down. Second, it showed us the brutal calculus of rescues. When the system breaks, the rescue efforts are never truly equitable. They are designed to save the system itself, which means saving the largest, most interconnected players. The powerful are bailed out. The wealthy are made whole. And the cost? The cost is passed down, paid for by the ordinary citizen through inflation, austerity, or lost opportunity. The rich are saved, the poor are sacrificed. It was true in 1907, and it was true in 2008. And finally, 1907 shattered the myth of linear progress. We love to believe that history is a straight line, always moving upward toward a better, safer, more enlightened future. But finance teaches us that history is not a line. It's a cycle, a spiral. We learn, we forget, and we repeat. The same patterns of human behavior, exuberance, greed, fear, and eventual collapse, spin on, just waiting for the next breaking point. If there is one single, undeniable message that the ghosts of 1907 are shouting at us across the decades, it's this: the next panic will come. It's not a question of if, it is only a question of when, and perhaps where. It might not start in the hallowed halls of Wall Street banks this time. The next crisis could ignite in the unregulated chaos of cryptocurrency markets. It could be triggered by a sovereign debt crisis in a country we've ignored. It could even be born from something we currently celebrate as progress, like the rapid, unchecked advance of artificial intelligence creating systemic risks we can't yet imagine. But the fuse will be lit, and when the explosion happens, we will find ourselves grappling with the very same questions that J.P. Morgan and President Teddy Roosevelt faced over a century ago. Who will step in to save us? The government? A new titan of finance? Or will there be no one? Who will ultimately pay the price for the bailout? And most importantly, will this finally be the time we learn the lesson? Or will we simply patch up the system, reset the clock, and doom the next generation to relive the same disaster all over again? The Panic of 1907 was so much more than a footnote in a history book. It was a near-death experience for the United States. It was the moment America almost lost everything: its economy, its global standing, and the very confidence of its people. It was also the moment that starkly revealed the double-edged sword of our system, that immense, concentrated power can be both our savior and our greatest danger. Today, we are walking on that same tightrope. We rely on a global financial system of unimaginable complexity, but its foundations are still built on the same shifting sands of human emotion and trust. So as you absorb this story, remember this: history isn't something that's safely behind us. It is the very ground beneath our feet, shaping the present in ways we rarely see. And unless we actively choose to learn its lessons, it will crack open and swallow us whole. Again, in our lifetime. If you found this journey back to 1907 eye-opening, don't let the conversation end here. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and most importantly, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because as the panic of 1907 proved, and as every crisis since has reminded us, no system is ever too big or too strong to fail. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the seeds of the next crisis are likely already being planted.